I know that we've got several people connected from the US as well as Canada, Europe, and other parts of the UK. So that's absolutely brilliant. And none of that would have been possible had it not been for the support of the people at the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities at Torch. So thanks a lot, Anbara, Justine, and Vicky for setting everything up. And thanks also to Nicholas, Avi, and Birgit, who are the minds, if you wish, behind this whole series of events. So my name is Ruggero. I'm a Librehulme Early Career Fellow here in Oxford, and I'm the Director of Digital Dolbug, which I'll introduce in just a second. Today I'm here with Laura Nicolì, a postdoctoral fellow at the Sorbonne in conjunction with the Voltaire Foundation, and of course, Professor Alan Charles Corse, an expert on Dolbug and one of the most acclaimed intellectual historians of the 18th century. Now, before we proceed to the interview, I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the general context for this event. So over the last few years, the Voltaire Foundation has put a lot of effort into reevaluating the works of Paul-Henri Thiry d'Holbach, a key figure of the European Enlightenment. In 2018, the Voltaire Foundation, with the support of the Andrew Mellon Foundation, launched a project to create an online platform for the creation and dissemination of critical editions of 18th century texts, and that's Digital Enlightenment. For the first phase of the project, we decided to work on two authors. The first one is indeed Voltaire. As you probably know, that massive undertaking that is the Oxford edition of the complete works of Voltaire is now quickly approaching its end. The very last few volumes will be published next year, and this is therefore the moment to scale things up a little. Nicholas is currently overviewing the digitization of the OCV, of the Œuvre Complète de Voltaire, and that's of course going to be enormously beneficial. Not only should we be able to reach a much wider audience, we shall also open entirely new avenues of research. You could trace, for example, the evolution of a text over time. You could use sequence alignment to identify instances of text reuse. You could pin down influences and so on. So that's the first author, Voltaire. The second one is d'Holbach. But in this case, we are confronted with a completely different situation. We don't have a kind of pre-existing edition that only need digitizing. We need to sit down and create the editions, because very few texts by d'Holbach are available in a critical edition. At the moment, we are working on 3 texts. I'm working on the Lettre Eugénie, an interesting text that proposes women as agents of social change, as well as on a much better known text, Le Bon Sens. At the same time, Laura is working on the Contagion Sacrée, which is indeed very timely. Besides the edition itself, we are also moving in many other directions. In March 2019, the Voltaire Foundation released, in collaboration with Clovis Gladstone at the Artful Project in Chicago, to d'Holbach, a fully searchable database of d'Holbach's works. And if you want to know more, I think we're going to organize a second event in Trinity, specifically devoted to this new and constantly growing tool. Almost simultaneously, we released an inventory of d'Holbach's correspondence, which is available on EMLO, on Early Modern Letters Online. Laura is currently editing a collection of essays on Dolbach, which will be published by Brill in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, and which contains brilliant essays by Alain Sandrier, Marie-Susanna Séguin, Jonathan Israel, and Alan Kors himself. And we are currently in the process of organizing another colloquium specifically devoted to the Système de la Nature, a colloquium to which this interview today serves as a sort of grand ouverture. So now, Laura, over to you.
Thank you, Ruggero, and many thanks to all of you for being here today, connecting from so many different places. For those of you who are not there at the beginning, so you are muted with cameras off, but you can put all your questions or thoughts in the chat or in the Q&A section, or also on Twitter, I guess, but I'm not sure how it works. So we have chosen 2020 for organizing this event because it's such a lucky and lovely year. No, so we have chosen 2020 because this year marks the 250th anniversary of the publication of Baron d'Holbach's Système de la Nature, ou des lois du monde physique et du monde moral. This book was first published in Amsterdam. As usual, it was written on the front page, Londres, but we know it was Amsterdam, in 1770 under the name of Mirabeau. It was just after d'Holbach's death that the true author was disclosed, and this book in 2 volumes represents not only the most celebrated and representative of d'Holbach's writings, but also one of the most important texts in European Enlightenment. Diderot and Negéon also took part in it. It circulated widely in Europe and was the object of so many reactions and also criticisms. With this work, d'Holbach and his circle wanted to give a definitive account of an openly materialistic and atheistic philosophy, which was for sure rooted in the clandestine literature of the previous decades, but for the first time was presented in such an open and systematic form. We have decided to talk about it with Professor Alan Charles Kors, whom I thank, and to whom we all owe so much in terms of the knowledge we have today about d'Holbach and this circle. Professor Kors is Henry Charles Lea Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Pennsylvania, where he taught for 49 years. He's a specialist in the field of early modern French intellectual history and the author of numerous books and articles, among which is d'Holbach's Coterie, An Enlightenment in Paris, first published in 1976 and recently reissued by Princeton University Press, has become a true classic in Enlightenment studies. He was also editor-in-chief of the 4-volume Encyclopedia of the Enlightenment by Oxford University Press, and more recently he published 2 works with Cambridge University Press, Naturalism and Unbelief in France and Epicureans and Atheists in France, both 1650-1729. So thank you very much for being here, Professor Kors. And let's start with the interview. So my first question concerns exactly the work we are celebrating today, the Système de la Nature. So the impression that most readers get from reading the Système de la Nature is that d'Holbach was something of a dogmatic or even an intransigent author and thinker. To what extent do you think this is true?
Philosophically, d'Holbach does not believe that his system of materialism, mechanism, atheism, a complete naturalism is demonstrable. And he reiterates this over and over, as does Diderot, as does Naigeon, the three true atheists at D'Holbach's salon. It is, above all, for D'Holbach, a moral choice, a human choice to make about how to deal with the world one finds oneself in. And he sees, as La Mettrie had seen, a stark choice between a spiritualism that he believes rests on no comprehensible idea, or a materialism that allows one, by the study and application of one's knowledge of nature, to alleviate the pains, improve the human condition. And it is, above all, on that historical and moral criterion that D'Holbach rests. He does not see metaphysical philosophy as demonstrable. I should add that his skepticism about philosophy and atheism is also one that leads him to the view that it is very unlikely that without centuries and centuries of progress, that human beings would accept an atheistic view of the world. They are desperately eager to propitiate the forces of nature, in his view, and they are fearful and afraid before those forces of nature. They will not be able even to want to know the truth about the world. In naturalistic terms, D'Holbach believes, until they have dealt with that fear and, as he puts it, that trembling before nature that leads people to seek invisible recourses to deal with the traumas and benefits of nature.
Thank you.
I'm waiting for questions. I don't want to let you.
Thank you. No, we've got a lot of questions. Actually, people are already starting to write their questions in the chat. So we'll just quickly move on to the second question, and then yeah. So the question that I wanted to ask is about well, the radical enlightenment, if you wish. Recent scholarship often insists on the existence of different strands of thought within the Enlightenment. D'Holbach, in a sense, may have benefited from this polarization of 18th century studies, where he's now very commonly indicated as one of the most prominent figures, if not the most prominent figure, of the so-called radical Enlightenment. But do you think that D'Holbach was actually a radical thinker? To what extent can we regard the Système de la Nature as the epitome of the so-called radical Enlightenment?
I think one has to look at the issue of the radicalism of D'Holbach in the real meaning of radical, going to the root of something in thought or in society. And there, D'Holbach's vision is as radical a vision as could be in the 18th century. When he thinks about what would be the human world he would want to live in, what the friend of the human race, which is how he will describe the atheist, what the friend of the human race can imagine as the future of mankind, there indeed he's radical. There is no supernaturalism. There are no church imposed upon people. Human beings will no longer turn to articulate theologians who talk about forces beyond human comprehension and beyond human perception. People will be moved absent supernatural incentives, absent the fear of hell and the promise of heaven for D'Holbach. people will be moved to seek their own earthly happiness. That's what's been denied human beings by ignorance, by fear, by superstition, by supernaturalism. Human beings will be restored to their natural minds, dealing with the world of nature around them, and seeking happiness. And seeking happiness, they will quickly learn, Dolbach believes, once freed from supernaturalism and superstition, dental work, forgive me, that it is in their personal interest and the interest of the society of which they're a member for people to be judged solely on the basis of their social utility, what they do to advance the well-being of the human species. In that sense, Dolbach has a vision that is extremely radical. But Dolbach also has an extreme elitism. He is very fearful of the common individual's participation in the political process. He fears mobs, and Dolbach again and again reiterates that human progress, the alleviation of suffering, the reform of governments, the judgment by utility of all things social, moral, and political, this will be the work of centuries. And it is possible after the work of centuries that gradual reform will leave people in a circumstance in which utility becomes their moral criterion. And they judge all of their fellow creatures on the basis of what they do to alleviate pain, enhance the well-being of the human community. But that is centuries from now. And Dolbach is anti-democratic. He is fearful of uneducated people and fearful of most educated people as well. So if one can be a democratic radical while fearing democracy and while fearing action taken now rather than centuries from now to affect any root and branch change in the human condition, then you can call him radical. I find that an odd appellation to give to someone who so fears radical change in his own world, in his own life.
Thank you. So maybe we could say a slow radical, new definition for Dolbach. Very slow radical. So my next question concerns...
If I can, he's a reformer, Dolbach, when he looks at the immediate world around him. He's a radical visionary when he lets himself think about the improbable but possible better human future that might await us.
I mean, there is also a strong pragmatic aspects in his text, so we should always consider also, yeah, the real possibility to turn his ideas into reality. So yeah,
but central through both the Système de la Nature, le bon sens, almost all of his political writings is this sense that people of 18th century France will hate, will reject the atheist, will hate and reject the materialist. That it's so crucial to keep up the program of the Enlightenment that has to do with a critique of despotism, a critique of religious authority, a critique of intolerance, and it's not accidental that Holbach publishes the work of so many of the English deists. That is an area where he thinks reform can come quickly, a loosening of people's allegiance to the church, but he is very fearful of the views of society toward the atheist, the unbeliever, the person who would deprive human beings of the consolation of heaven, of the consolations of a God who oversees the operations of nature in humanity's favor.
So next question concerns the concept of system itself. We know that Holbach wrote not only the Système de la Nature, but also another system, the Système social. And he also contributed more than 400 articles to the Encyclopédie of Diderot and D'Alembert, which can somehow be defined also like a big system of knowledge. And all this was happening in at a time when empiricism, so and somewhat anti-systematic way of thinking, was gaining momentum across Europe. So how do these two aspects of Enlightenment thought, the esprit de système and empiricism, coexist within Holbach's two systems?
I think that when Holbach uses the term system, he does not mean a complete and articulated systematic philosophy, either in ethics or in sensationalistic materialism. Holbach, I think, has picked up the same use that La Mettrie makes in La Machine and other works, that there are two fundamental ways of approaching knowledge in this world. One of them metaphysical, spiritual, supernatural, and one of them wholly natural. So La Mettrie in Man and Machine, La Machine, will say there have been two philosophical systems since ancient times: the system of materialism and the system of spiritualism. And I do think that Holbach uses system in that same sense. What would a philosophy of nature look like that removed the God, spirit, immaterial substance, supernaturalism from the equation? What would a moral philosophy look like if it were based solely upon humankind's natural, empirically known needs, if it were based upon the principle of utility rather than a striving after some revealed moral system? So for Holbach, the notion of system is not a claim that he is going to present to you here, a full system, which is why if you look at the Système de la Nature, what you above all have is criticism of views that fail us and what an alternative to those views would look like. It is less the articulation of a full positive philosophy than an attempt to demolish revealed religious supernaturalist approaches to knowledge and to ethics and to politics, and then an attempt, I'd say, more to outline what a purely naturalistic philosophy of nature and philosophy of ethics would be.
Yeah, which it's finally very coherent with empiricism. So the contradiction was only apparent.
Yeah, I think we can also go back to the issue of the complexity of Holbach's philosophy and all the contradictions later on in the Q&A, because that's a very interesting topic. Before we get there, just one last question about the future of Holbach studies. like many other fundamental texts, the Système de la Nature met with different responses at different times. Do you think that the Système could still speak to modern readers? What could it teach us? What could be done to make his works more widely available? And what are the main research questions that still need to be addressed?
It seems to me that it's temperamental and constitutional. I'm not sure I want to get into issues of what Holbach has to teach the 21st century. There are naturalistic voices in the 21st century, quite different from Holbach, and the relationship there seems to me very complex and difficult. What interests me above all, and where I see the important research projects, is in understanding Holbach in context. And one of the first major questions are, who are his interlocutors? People, historians, scholars, people in Romance languages will look frequently at Holbach and assume that the influences on him are continental or French. If you look at the interlocutors whom Holbach explicitly chooses, it's quite remarkable how many of them, in fact, are English, and English from 2, sometimes 3 generations prior to Holbach's concerns. So whom does he address in the Système de la Nature? Samuel Clarke, the British theologian, Ralph Cudworth, the so-called Cambridge Platonist, 17th century, anti-Cartesian. Why those authors? With whom is he debating and why? That seems to me a great unanswered question in Holbach scholarship. Another way to get at that is to pursue Holbach's footnotes, which are extremely interesting. One of the ways, for example, that we know how closely intertwined the intellectual lives of Diderot, Naigeon, Holbach are, is there they all are citing Seneca in one way or another in 1770. And there's Holbach, whose footnotes on Seneca are very, very close to Naigeon's own thinking about Seneca. So knowing the interlocutors, knowing the influences, and one of the great unexplored areas, we know Holbach's library. When he died, that library went up for sale. The seller printed a catalog of Holbach's works. His knowledge of 17th century theological debate, of 17th century mutual refutations, proofs of the existence of God, his knowledge of Epicureanism and ancient philosophy, of medieval philosophy. Well, let's look for those in the texts. He has in his library given us an example of his reading, as has Naigeon, who is even much more of a bibliophile and book collector than Holbach. And scholars, I think, rather than looking to the 21st century, really do need to sort out Holbach in his 18th century context and in his 17th and 18th century concern.
Yeah, no, those would all be, extremely interesting topics. Yeah, so reconstructing Holbach's library, for example, that'll be great. I mean, it'd be great if one could identify the books that Holbach actually owned, and maybe they could contain.
We know them. We know every single one of them. It's online. It's in print.
Yeah, no, we've got a catalog, but it'd be wonderful if we could identify the copies that he owned.
Oh,
if any of those survive.
Yes.
And maybe there could be marginalia or things like that, and it would be amazing to actually look at them.
Yes, that would be extraordinarily useful.
Mm. No, absolutely. And so now the floor is open for discussion. I'm sorry that this cannot be a real discussion, but you can post your questions either on the chat or on the Q&A or on Twitter. So we've got an hashtag, it's HolbachBF. So you can use any of these means, and we'll just read your questions on your behalf. And
questions already. I don't know if there is something on Twitter, but maybe we can start from the chat. So Percy Vogel asks, it would seem logical that Dolbach was inspired a lot by Spinoza, and yet he hardly refers to Spinoza in his Système de la Nature. So what's the relationship between Dolbach and Spinoza?
This is a question which, along with, I'm sure I'm in good company with a lot of people, has sent me back to Holbach to look for signs of the influence of Spinoza that has become such a powerful argument being made by schools of history now, above all out of the work of Jonathan Israel. And Holbach does not address Spinoza very directly. In the Système de la Nature, he says that Spinoza's philosophy follows precisely from Descartes' principles, which Descartes himself could not have seen what followed from those principles, but did not have the courage to see. And he gives us a naturalistic Spinoza, this chapter on fantasme in the Système de la Nature. But in the final analysis, Spinoza is much too metaphysical for Holbach. And that is why I believe he does not address him. What thrill he must have felt for the Tractatus, for Spinoza's critique of the religious traditions and the divine status of scripture. But how uninterested he is in Spinoza in the Ethics, pausing in effect to ask questions about the real nature of substance. For Holbach, all questions about the real nature of things and the real nature of material substance, the real nature of substance, these are unanswerable labyrinths, and minds that care about the secular future of humanity don't waste their time there. I think Spinoza's naturalism is very exciting to him. Yes, there is only one substance. And for Holbach, we see what it is. It's matter. Do we know what matter is? No, but there it is. There's matter and there's motion. And matter in motion produces all the behaviors that we can observe in this world. Spinoza wants to ask the question, what is substance? What are its modes and what knowledge do we have of them? And that is not where Holbach's philosophy goes. So it is not accidental that he mentions Spinoza infrequently. And he also argues in the Système de la Nature that Malebranche's philosophy leads directly to Spinozism, because he sees Malebranche as positing essentially only one knowable substance, God, and sees that as a Spinozistic naturalism and monism. But Holbach is not terribly interested in metaphysical questions. In the Système de la Nature, even when he turns to Descartes' proofs of the existence of God. He does it in very short shrift with a few caricatures and looks for a few things Descartes has said about God in nature that will seem absurd to readers. He doesn't get in there to debate metaphysical issues. For Holbach, that's a waste of time.
Yeah. So, Patrick, Peter.
But that's half an answer to your question, if I might. The second half won't be long. But I think that Holbach's influences are not deep influences, are not Spinoza's. When he travels, say, in the 1730s and comes back with Hobbes's De Homine, which he'll translate as his Traité de Hobbes's Traité de la Nature Humaine. That is where he gets his epistemological monism. It's not an ontological monism that we know what being is, and we know that being is only corporeal. It's an epistemological materialism that he believes he sees in Hobbes's Traité, that all we can conceive of are material entities capable of striking the senses and their behaviors and abstractions that we base upon corporeal entities and their behavior. And he brings Hobbes to France, has Diderot read the De Homine, has Naigeon read it, and both of them say, this is the great philosophical moment. Hobbes is understood. The second reading that so influences Hobbes is John Toland in his materialist phase, the letters to Serena, which Holbach will translate as the Lettre philosophique. And what Toland argues there is that what we know is matter in motion. And motion is an essential, inherent part of matter. And matter is never inert. Matter is always the possessor of a motive force. So one of the problems that a naturalist philosopher, materialist philosopher, has to explain is how does spontaneous rather than acquired motion occur? Right? If I hit my hand, we can explain its movement, right? But look at this extraordinary thing I can do. And go up. And go down. Right? The materialist has to explain where spontaneous motion isn't acquired by another moving corporeal body, where spontaneous motion comes from. And there, where Diderot and Naigeon move toward a more organic, alive sense of nature in almost what we now might term a biological sense, but relying on the life science. Science de la vie. Holbach wants a purely physical model. He believes that all motion will be explained in terms of attraction and repulsion, in terms of Newton's model of gravity, but that Newton was wrong about matter being inert. Since there is a motive force in matter, matter is inherently active. And so for Holbach, the influence of Toland gives him a physical model rather than a life sciences model of the life, if you will, of nature. Much more than Spinoza. Hobbes and Toland excite Holbach to the marrow. He shows them to all of his friends. He translates them both. Those are the exciting sources.
Yes, it's amazing how so many different sources combine in the box system. So next, we have two questions inspired by the dispute on radical enlightenment. So the first one is Patrick Peterson's question, who asks, would you consider Holbach a classical liberal or an early libertarian?
I would consider him a skeptical Enlightenment materialist, deeply suspicious of attempts at political change. I think it's impossible to put Holbach in categories that would quickly become anachronistic, given the vast, really extraordinary difference between the problems faced by someone in the waning decades of the old regime, which they did not know was waning, and intellectuals with the political, ideological choices of the 21st century. And again, Holbach's politics are not very systematic. When he envisions that future centuries from now, toward which it's doubtful but possible human beings might move felicitously, there indeed he favors what one might consider today classical liberal values, that your reward should be on the basis of your production, that we should accept real inequalities in terms of incentives, that all people are legally equal, that indeed legal equality is a foundation of a decent society. These are all Holbachian beliefs, but they're all for a future that might or might not happen. There's no historical teleology in Holbach. Humanity is not moving toward something known. In the time when I first got interested in Holbach in the 1960s, and indeed into the early 70s, most good work that was being done on Holbach was being done by Marxist intellectuals, or much of it was being done by Marxist intellectual historians, for whom Holbach was a building block en route toward Marx and dialectical materialism. Well, the Marxists may have had a teleology of history that way. Holbach certainly did not. He believed, as Diderot also came to believe, and as Naigeon believed, that the man of virtue bears witness to what he thinks is in the interests of humankind, without expectation of success.
Still following up on the radical enlightenment, Nicholas Cronk observes that as you described Holbach in so many, not always, it sounds not so very different from Voltaire, despite Jonathan Israel's distinction between moderate and radical enlightenment. So what do you think about that?
In terms of his influence upon the 18th century, Voltaire is a much more radical philosopher than Holbach is. But if by radical you mean materialistic monism, then by definition, Holbach is more radical than Voltaire. Voltaire, of course, became deeply upset by the stream of atheistic literature that begins to emerge from Paris in the 1770s. He adds the article Dieu, God, adds a whole lengthy section that is an attempted refutation of Holbach. Voltaire will write a poem such as Les Cabals, in which he's virtually identifying the people around Holbach, not by name, as people who are spewing this out, Voltaire thinks that atheism is intellectually absurd, that it's the equivalent of saying that Arctic animals have Arctic camouflage and desert animals have desert camouflage by chance. That just seems an absurdity to Voltaire. He can't take rejection of the argument from design, which is very different from rejection of Leibnizian optimism. But he cannot take rejection of the argument from design seriously. The world simply seems designed to him. Secondly, he believes that atheism, Voltaire, poses an extraordinary danger to mankind because almost the only thing that might restrain a despot, a tyrant, who has nothing to fear from human beings, would be a fear of God. And he warns the Parisian atheists. If one loses that, one loses restraint upon power. So for Voltaire, atheism is reactionary, as it was for Robespierre as well during the Revolution. Voltaire is a thinker who is changing people's behavior in the 18th century. That is not Dolbach. But the vision that Dolbach has is certainly a monistic, materialist, atheistic one. And if that is, by definition, a requirement of being a radical philosopher, then Voltaire is not who Dolbach is. But that seems to me more semantic than substantive.
Yeah, and then even the question of Dolbach's atheism could be asked. I mean, to what extent he was actually a pure dogmatic atheist.
Holbach always warns against certainty, but I think it's safe to say that if there is one thing that Dolbach is certain of, it is that there is no good force guiding and directing this universe. As he says to his deistic readers, he said, in your world of a designing benevolent God, I see only the suffering.
Now, we've got two more questions by from Marian Abson. So they are both connected to the question of readership. Do we know what sort of people bought Dolbach's books, and what sort of evidence is there that Dolbach's books were read as opposed to only mentioned?
I think the number of editions that appear of Système de Nature and of Dolbach's work speaks to that. But this is a very important question and a difficult question, because one of the goals of censorship in the librairie and activity by the police in the wake of Dolbach's Système de Nature, but I think this is true of censorship of the philosophes in 18th century France in general. The goal is drive up the price. Almost no effort to get the author. Almost no effort to get the bookstore sellers. You go after the colporteurs, the people who are hawking, open a coat and there are books that they're selling. The colporteurs, they are rounded up, they are pursued. The police reports in 1770, 1771 are enormously interesting. Dolbach's Système de Nature is confiscated when a colporteur has it. Colporteurs are fined or punished. The price of the book goes up. It's a risk to be selling it. But there are several instances right there in the main police reports, collection, Anson Dupéron, reports of the police inspector Emeritus that he's just gotten word that they have seized the Countess's copy of the Système de la Nature, or they've seized a copy of the lawyer's and he wants it back. He paid, and get that back to him. And there seems to be almost no concern about the well-off reading D'Holbach. Certainly those with privilege in the Ancien regime could read what they want if you look at the police records. The goal is to keep the price up, but if they do keep the price up, which appears to be the case, then you have limited the audience for that book, unless, which is doubtful, people are lending copies of theirs to people who can't afford them. But it's an audience that takes the work so serious that they write about it and they talk about it. So there's a second exposure to D'Holbach's work. There's a wonderful irony in the response of the Parlement de Paris to D'Holbach's work. The requisition is written by Séguier. And to get the parliament to condemn the Système de la Nature, he goes through the most subversive, outrageous, blasphemous quotations you could find in the book. The harshest arguments against belief in God that you could find in the book. Well, what gets banned and what the police successfully crack down on, almost get it off the streets, isn't the Système de la Nature, it's Séguyer's requisitoire. It's the condemnation written for the parliament, which was circulating, it turns out, widely, and the police cracked down on it because that's how a large number of people were encountering D'Holbach's arguments for the first time. And it's hard to believe that people who read the condemnation of the parliament, who read the condemnation of the assembly of the clergy, who read someone who, the apologist of the church, the Abbé Bergier, who was pensioned to write a refutation of the Système de la Nature, that people who read these striking, exciting, offensive pieces weren't titillated and didn't want to read the book itself. Part of this world of privileged readers can be seen in theory. The entire network of authority in France in 1770 should be looking for the author of the Système de la Nature. And the church has pensioned Nicolas Sylvestre Bergier, one of its foremost theologians, to write the refutation of D'Holbach's Système. But we now have letters from Bergier to people he knows, and he's writing to an abbé who's a friend of his, and he says, well, I'm getting along with my refutation of the Système de la Nature. I showed my draft of the first part to D'Holbach and Diderot, and they don't think my work is going to have much effect, or that it really comes to grips with the atheistic arguments of the Système. What a remarkable moment. And Bergier dines at D'Holbach's, at his salon. They discuss the Système de la Nature, but no one will mention that he is the author. Mohalet has a remarkable riff on this, where he says, we all knew the work appeared, and we all said to ourselves, these are the arguments we hear from him at his salon, but no one would ask him, no one would say, no one would mention, no one would write about it, no one would talk about it. So it's a very interesting world around the Système. I've wandered far from the important question about readership, and that's because I can't answer it in detail, specificity, and accuracy.
So So I think also the second question was, yeah, okay. Enrico Galvani has a question about moral philosophy. He writes, Holbach talks of utility and has been often seen as a hero of utilitarianism. But his ethics strongly emphasizes virtue and the fact that the virtuous agent will, on the long run, benefit of his own actions, which is a position very close to ancient systems, such as Aristotle's eudaimonistic ethics. Could you tell us something more about where Holbach's ethics come from and what are the main influences on his ethical thought? Thank you.
Yes. Holbach believes as deeply as he believes anything, that the origin of human fear and acquiescence, and trembling before powers, and following all those who people believe can propitiate the gods who control nature, that all of this arises from the human desire for well-being, for ease from pain, and for well-being, for happiness. That is how religion came into the world, desperate efforts to propitiate the forces of nature to achieve human well-being. So for Holbach, that historically, obviously has not only failed, it's created a phantasmagoria. But he also believes that that human will to ease pain and secure well-being is the means of any possible redemption of the human condition. That human beings will always, and here he's following Hobbes's of human nature as well, that human beings always will choose what they believe will alleviate ill, suffering, pain. They will always choose what they believe will bring about well-being and a fruitful human condition and a peaceful society, cooperative society. So Holbach believes that all we mean by virtue, and one can find that sentence almost word for word in Diderot, word for word in Holbach, word for word in Nejon. What we mean by virtue are those things that we believe will lead to alleviation of our suffering and improvement of our condition in the world. And we give that the name of virtue. And that is a fruit of our knowledge. If one labels virtue those things that do not bring about happiness, that are not justified by utility, one distorts the entire human condition and all social relationships. So he reaches the equation of virtue and the true causes of happiness by his sense that that is what human beings seek. And when they believe they have it, it is what human beings choose and do. It's very different from, let's say, Locke in the essay, or a Bishop Butler addressing moral philosophy in the Sermons on Human Nature, who argues that God has harmonized the moral and the physical sphere. That God has made virtue, which exists as virtue, independent of anything but the will of God. That God has made virtue the cause of enduring and true human happiness. So you might say that for Holbach, nature has made virtue the true causes of human well-being and the alleviation of pain, except by nature has made it. What Dolbach means by that is the human condition. That is the world in which we find ourselves.
Thank you. Both Caroline Warman and Percy Vogel are curious about the role Diderot had in Dolbach's writings. So, do we know how Dolbach's writings projects worked, and what role Diderot and Négeon had? In some recent work, writes Caroline, I have done on Négeon and the Memoir sur Diderot, it seems not to rewrite Diderot, but to cut up all the sentences and reorder them. Did he do this, that with Dolbach's work too? So the role of Diderot and Négeon in Dolbach's writings.
First, it's easier to talk about the role of Négeon in this, which is very extensive. In the first edition, not all printings have it, but in the first editions of Dolbach's Système de la Nature, there is a 16-page preliminary discourse that is written, in fact, by Négeon. And Négeon is Dolbach's closest collaborator and the only individual in Dolbach's salon who is involved with the actual publication of the Système, and indeed of Dolbach's works. Later in life, during the Empire Restoration, Négeon talks with Barbier, the author of the Dictionnaire des Anonymes, about his role in Holbach's work. And everything he says to Barbier, I make this case in Dolbach's coterie if people wish to evaluate it, has held up in terms of additional evidence and supportive evidence. And indeed, Négeon's brother, whom we know only as Négeon le Jeune, Négeon's brother had a copy of the Système de la Nature, and on the flyleaf, he wrote the whole story of how it got published. And that fell decades later into Barbier's hands, and he separately asked Négeon, or Jacques-André Négeon, about whether or not, no, about how Dolbach's work was published, how the Système was actually published. Négeon would, and Négeon told Barbier exactly the same thing, that Holbach wrote the Système de la Nature by hand, just himself, gave it to Négeon. Négeon sent it to his brother, who would copy it in his own hand and burn the copy that was written in Dolbach's hand. And he would send that to a woman, I think it was in Liège, who did business with the publisher Marc Michel Rey. She would get the manuscript to Rey, it would be published, and of course come back into France, as we know, under diplomatic cover most usually, or in the baggage of aristocrats or people of wealth who were just allowed to pass the frontier with whatever they had. Diderot didn't like that they were doing this. He writes to Sophie Voland that he is extremely worried about Holbach and Négeon. As he writes to Sophie Voland, they are throwing bombs into the house of the Lord, and I am very fearful about what is going to become of them. Diderot, as most of you know, didn't take much concern to publish his atheistic writings in his lifetime. His most atheistic works were left with Négeon, who, to the despair of literary critics, is his literary executioner, executive, and executor. And that was a Freudian slip, literary In fact, I think Naigeon understands Diderot quite well. Diderot had written roughly near that same time to David Hume, saying, stop writing philosophy, give up, no one's going to understand you. We are so far from the century of reason. Write history. Keep up with your histories. Those will improve people. And he also thought that it was simply premature for D'Holbach and Naigeon to be writing as they were writing, publishing as they were publishing. Diderot will write that there are no readers for this work now. We are so far from an appropriate time for people to consider atheism, which is why for Diderot, the real effort is the encyclopédie. That's where he puts his time into. In fact, when he leaves his materialist and atheistic writings with Naigeon, he even says, publish these when they won't harm anyone, probably having his beloved and deeply Catholic daughter in mind. But he is not someone who, like D'Holbach, is eager to get this out. Intellectually, his atheism is very different from Holbach's, in that it lies in this active, spontaneously moving matter. It's a much more animate matter, organic matter in Diderot's system. D'Holbach's writing on the Newtonian basis of all motion in the world, is very far removed from Diderot's conceptions. So there, even Naigeon rejects D'Holbach's purely physicists as opposed to life sciences approach to understanding matter, its movements, and how that accounts for phenomena in the world in his Philosophie ancienne et moderne, the work that the publisher Pankouk has him do during the French Revolution. He writes on Toland, and he very specifically faults Toland for what he sees as this motive force of nature, force motrice, that Toland and D'Holbach insist on. And he argues explicitly against D'Holbach's uses of Toland and the Lettres philosophiques, and that D'Holbach failed to see the flaws in Toland's way of thinking about nature and movement. So it leaves our D'Holbach as rather singular and very much a philosopher in his own self-carved right, but Naigeon is very important, both to his thinking, playing ideas off at the salon, and of course publication. I don't know who I'm waving to here. I talk with my hands, which must look odd on a Zoom screen. Naigeon, as close as he is to D'Holbach, does not follow him into this purely physicist model of nature. And Diderot, as I say, both philosophically, but also strategically and tactically, was not active in D'Holbach's publication. But there's one possible exception to that claim, and it also poses a problem for D'Holbach scholars. D'Holbach is very insistent throughout the Système de Nature, and could not be more explicit, that it would be a terrible thing to personify nature, let alone to deify nature, and to talk about it as if it were a personality. Well, the Système de Nature ends with a very curious passage and a very curious chapter, the Code de la Nature, the Code de la Nature, the code of nature, which personifies nature, which deifies nature, which gives it a wonderful personality nature. And there was speculation, but I think we need really dispositive scholarship on this issue, that in the way that Raynal and others frequently would turn to Diderot, and Grimm would turn to Diderot for, can you add a little rhetorical spice to this? Can you make this prose soar? My best guess, but it's only speculation. So I'd love it if someone in the audience knew the truth about that last chapter, the Code de la Nature, is that it was a five-finger exercise by Diderot. Can you make this soar at the end? Let's have a nice rhetorical ending. And it betrays and belies everything D'Holbach has said about the absurdity of personifying nature.
So we have 3 more questions for now. I think we can, maybe the last questions, I think, Ruggero, no? We still have 3 more questions. I think we have time for this.
Yeah, I think so.
So next questions concerns again the problem of readership. Nicolas Cronk asks, Le Bon Sens is shorter, so cheaper than the Système de la Nature, and was often reprinted in the 70s. That must have had a somewhat larger readership. So it must have had a somewhat larger readership, or not?
Oh yes, that seems to me indubitable. Le Bon Sens sells very widely, and if a book is cheaper, it is going to be more widely read if people are interested in that line of thought. And in Le Bon Sens, Holbach allows himself certain things and perhaps knows it's going to be read by somewhat less exalted readership than the Système de la Nature. There's an extraordinary moment in Le Bon Sens where the question that people always ask the atheist is, what if you're wrong? What are you going to do when you find yourself in heaven and God says to you, look, here you were wrong. And D'Holbach says in Le Bon Sens, oh, I would address that God. And I would say, how dare all of this suffering? How dare this phantasmagoria, this nightmare in which human beings have lived? And I would conclude by saying to God, well, at least I was mentally free of your tyranny for a while. So there is this side to Le Bon Sens where I think he's more in the trenches talking to an audience and anticipating what they might say to him and ask him. And Le Bon Sens surely attracted readers. The interesting question, and it's an empirical question for scholarship to answer, is if you read a work such as Le Bon Sens, does it make you more likely now to invest in the purchase, the acquisition of the Système de la Nature as well? But you didn't need to read the Système de la Nature to know its arguments. Bergier, in his refutation, the Examen du Materialisme, does a wonderful job in laying out Chaudon, Castillon, the people who write widely circulated refutations of the Système de la Nature. They do a pretty good job of giving what his arguments are. And as I say, the requisitoire of Séguier to the Parliament attracted a huge audience, not because people wanted to see how a prosecutor thought, but because people said, oh, look, I can get access here to the full range of all of this scandalous prose. It was exciting. I wander quite far from the actual question posed. I'm becoming aware of that.
It's
Too late.
what we wanted. And we force you also to jump from a subject to another. So now we jump back to the question of sources and collaborations. So last two questions. John Robertson asks, what was D'Holbach's interest in the work of Boulanger? And do we know whether D'Holbach intervened in Boulanger text when he edited it? We know that he edited Boulanger works. So what was his intervention on them?
I won't risk since D'Holbach and Neigeon, well, D'Holbach through Neigeon boasted to Barbier that whenever they translated a work, they atheized it as much as they could. But what that almost invariably meant was with the English deists leaving in their critical deism, their critiques of Christianity and revealed religion, but removing their positive deism, the attempt to prove God, the phenomena of nature. So it is possible. I would have to do the work that obviously someone either has done or now needs to do to compare those texts very specifically. But the question of the influence of Boulanger on Holbach's thinking is an important one, and in some ways a dramatic one. And this obviously struck other people as well, because one of the nicknames that D'Holbach and Neigeon and Diderot gave to D'Holbach's salon was La Boulangerie. The bakery, lots of nice confections coming out of this, but more than very possibly a play on the name of Boulanger. Boulanger, in his Recherche sur l'origine du despotisme oriental, research into the origins of Oriental despotism, and in his Antiquity l'Antiquité dévoilée par ses usages, Antiquity now exposed for what it is by its practices. Boulanger had argued that the origin of religion lay in the human response to what history and mythology clearly taught us was a period of natural calamity on Earth. Earthquakes, volcanoes, floods. Boulanger is very struck by how many cultures at the same period of history are describing floods, volcanoes, earthquakes. And he sees what had been, this is Boulanger, what had been a pastoral people suddenly confronted by these catastrophic events beyond their control that brought the death and helplessness. And fearful, human beings sought to propitiate the forces that obviously hated them in the world. They analogized it to a parent punishing a child for the wrong behavior. What could you do about plague? A relevant question now. What could you do about plague? What could you do? Earthquakes, floods, and people in fear identified what they believed had to be there, or they were totally helpless. Forces that they could appease and get to stop punishing them. At that point, ambitious people, clever people, saw that if they claimed to be the link, this is Boulanger's vision, they claimed to be the link between natural phenomena, catastrophes, and human beings, and they could tell people what they must do in order to appease the forces afflicting them, people would give them despotic power gladly, in fear, and in gratitude at anyone seeking to propitiate the forces of nature. For Holbach, this is the perfect explanation for the origin of religion in the world. It is the perfect explanation for how human beings arrived at supernaturalism. And when you read Holbach on the origin of the idea of God and the origin of belief in God or gods, Boulanger is central to that intellectually. You see Boulanger's work. Did he translate him faithfully? I don't know. But he is certainly imbued with a sense of the compelling nature, in his view, of Boulanger's account of why it is that these creatures of nature should invent supernatural entities and in desperation should believe in people who, if obeyed and followed, knew what to do about those agencies behind nature who inflicted such trauma on us.
You know, the issue of authorship is absolutely crucial, right? So to what extent Diderot and Lejeune contributed to Dolbach's writings, to what extent Dolbach altered Boulanger's works, and so on. This is all crucial, and who knows, maybe the edition. I mean, when we actually come to editing these works, maybe that will cast light on all these questions. I think we've got one last question about precisely about the question of collaborative authorship, and then we can come to a conclusion. But so Marian Upson asks, you have said that Dolbach is often and in different ways far from Diderot, but then why does Diderot seems to have a hand in producing the texts? What sort of explanation are we looking for here? Is it a psychological? Are we looking for a psychological answer?
One, of course, there are so few materialistic, naturalistic atheists who share this view of the world. Diderot and Dolbach certainly disagreed on the appropriateness of putting one's major effort into an attempt to atheize the world. That's not where Diderot's activity is focused. But they meet frequently, they're close friends. They might disagree about Toland's physical theory, but they share a view of lost humanity, struggling to find ways to understand and affect the world in which it finds itself, to which naturalistic knowledge is the only remedy. They share that. That is so close. Holbach and Diderot and Lejeune see each other frequently. Diderot is not a very active participant in most salons in Paris. He certainly is in Dolbach's. And they're always talking about and arguing with deists there and indeed with Christians there about atheism, naturalism, and materialism. Diderot is a helping hand to almost everyone at Dolbach's salon. When Grimm needs something written to the Correspondance Littéraire, he'll ask Diderot to write that. And Diderot so often will. And when Reynal, working on the Histoire philosophique, needs certain chapters covered, he'll ask Diderot, among others. So we have Diderot's hand in Reynal's Histoire philosophique. I think this happens all the time at Dolbach's salon. It's not an active collaboration with agreed upon philosophical goals. It's responses to each other's arguments. And in the case of Diderot, a frequently borrowed pen. So he's impatient with Diderot. Diderot is impatient with Holbach. Clearly much less so with Naigeon. He names him literary executor. It's probably the most famous literary executor about whom we know so little. You asked about scholarly agendas that need to be done. Let's find out about Naigeon. Where's he from? What's his story? What was his itinerary? What's the etiology of Naigeon's thinking? He is Holbach's closest collaborator, and he is almost an unknown figure. I hope people have gone beyond what I was able to discover about his life outside of his intellectual life when I wrote Holbach's Coterie. But my sense is he remains a man who needs a lot of scholarly attention.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. At this point, I ask you to join me in thanking Professor Kors for this interview, but I'm afraid that we cannot really do that. So, well, thank you, Professor Kors, and I just wanted to make two final announcements, basically, two final remarks. So the first,
one last thing.
Oh yeah, please.
No, sorry. Just wanted to say on this issue of what links Diderot and Naigeon, Holbach, because they're part of such an extraordinary sense of themselves in their moment of thought. They see themselves as offering to the world a new system of value and philosophy that incorporates what has come to be known in the 17th century's revolution in natural philosophy and in the physical and life sciences, in which we find ourselves in an unplanned universe that does not care for us, with only ourselves and our knowledge to rely on in our effort to coexist with nature and to coexist with each other. That's an extraordinary sense in a world surrounded by deists and Christians. It is a link that I think tells us something about the closeness of the three atheists at Holbach's Cellar. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you for
Thank you very much.
agreeing to do this. So I think that Avi Lifshitz, so we were talking before about Berger and Diexano. I think that Avi has just published a book which includes an edition of Frederick the Great's refutation of these of Holbach's works. And I think that we are gonna talk about that book at a later event. So I don't know exactly when that's gonna happen, but Avi, Katriona Seth, and Kelsey Rubin-Detlef, they're gonna talk about recently published books on Enlightenment monarchs. So please do join us for that. And then again, we've got one more event in a fortnight, I think. So on Thursday, the 19th of November at 5:15, we're going to have the Westermann lecture. And our speaker this year will be William Doyle, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Bristol. And he's going to talk about French revolutionaries. So in a way, these may be connected or maybe not to, well, the issue of Holbach and radicalism and whatnot. So please do join us for the Westermann lecture as well. And thank you very much again, Professor Kors, for this. interesting.
Caroline Warman writes, yes, that Mario Cosenza is just an thesis on Négeon.
That's right.
It's quite rare. Published under the name All'ombra dei lumi. So for those who are interested in it, there is a link to the
And I
thesis.
think Caroline is doing some, is also doing some work on Négeon. So yeah, clearly there are people out there who are doing some work on, you know, Négeon, and so maybe that will also cast some light on Dolbach, or who knows, we'll see. Right, thank you very much. And
many questions we had today show that there is an interest in this author, which is superior to the extent it is studied on it, really. So thank you.
Someone just posted the link to the Westermann lecture, so you'll find it in the chat. Right, thank you very much, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, everybody. Would be
Bye-bye.
nice to see you, but
Yeah, no, exactly.
bye-bye.